Hi, my name is Dr. Brian Jack. I'm Associate Professor of History at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, where I teach African American history, Southern history, history of Civil War and slavery. And I'm also the director of the university's Studying Slavery Initiative, where we look at and examine the legacies of slavery and its racial legacies in the region. And I'd like to thank the Madison County Historical Society for asking me to give this talk. I'd like to thank Cindy Reinhardt, Steve Hansen, my former colleague, Bob Gill for doing the recording. And today I'm going to talk about Sundown Towns in Madison County, Illinois. I want to explain in this first slide kind of how the talk will be organized. I'm going to talk about what are sundown towns. We'll talk about some definitions of sundown towns, kind of the scholarship that's happened around sundown towns, the previous research that's been done, talk about the prevalence in the United States and in particular in Illinois of sundown towns. Illinois in many ways is kind of ground central for sundown towns. We'll talk a little bit about the impact on the present and the questioning assumptions of sundown towns. And I'm also going to look at a couple of examples of sundown towns in Madison County. I'm not going to go through each individual town in Madison County and say this was a sundown town or this one isn't. There are a lot of towns and villages in Madison County, and what I'm trying to do is kind of set the framework for further research so that people in the community, people like y'all, the Historical Society, students of mine can research individual towns. But I kind of want to set the framework and understanding about what sundown towns are, and then give kind of some tips on further research for people. So first, I'd like to give this overview in this slide. You can see it says, "Welcome to Illinois, the land of Lincoln, from the people of Illinois." And Illinois has this reputation and view of itself as being the land of Lincoln, and we are the North, and this idea of the land of freedom and the Midwest, and oftentimes, kind of racially in the United States, we want to look at the South. And we want to look at the South and lay kind of all our racial blame and guilt on the South because of slavery in particular. Scholarship in the last few decades has really been shifting and trying to understand racism as a national phenomenon. And studying sundown towns in particular, which were much more a function in the Midwest and the North than they were in the South, really helps us to understand the legacy of racism in the country in a much more broad way, and understand the framework of kind of institutional racism in the United States in a different way. So let's talk about what we mean by sundown towns. As it says on the slide, according to James Loewen, and I'll talk about James Loewen in a minute, a sundown town is, quote, any organized jurisdiction that for decades kept African Americans or other groups living in it and was thus all white, quote unquote, on purpose. Now, by that definition, it's not necessarily a written ordinance. It's not necessarily a law on the books that says African Americans are not allowed to live in this town or sometimes even be in this town after sundown. Sometimes it is de jure, where it was a local ordinance. Other times, and often it's more de facto, where it is the unwritten rules, making people feel unwelcome, violently running people out of town. Using law enforcement to run people out of town. Real estate, not selling to African Americans or other groups that are excluded from the town. Violence, intimidation, cross burnings. We have examples and we have sources that cite all these different ways of excluding people from sundown towns. Just a kind of a personal aside, I grew up in a small town in Kansas, and town of 1,000 people till 8th grade. And the rumor was when I was growing up, and I was too young to kind of understand it, but growing up in the 70s, that there were no African Americans allowed in my town after sundown. And it was an all-white town when I lived there. And there was a whistle that blew every night at 6 o'clock. As I got older and started to understand this research, that was a pretty common thing. Towns would blow this whistle at 6 o'clock as a warning for people to be out of town by sundown. Brent Campney, so that was James Loewen's definition. It's kind of restrictive, that definition a little bit. Other historians have kind of expanded the definition a bit. Brent Campney makes the argument that a town doesn't have to be completely all white to be a sundown town. He makes the argument that a town can be all white or mostly all white and have a small African American population that's segregated in a very specific part of town, and that could still qualify as a sundown town, right? It's not just, a sundown town isn't just a place where something racist happened. It isn't just a place where a lynching happened. It's an entire community, sometimes even a county. Loewen has documented counties that were sundown counties. It's an entire community or county that for decades is all white on purpose, or almost all white. The other reason that we have kind of all white in quotes is because when you're going back and looking at the census data, sometimes they will show African Americans living in a town, and so people might gloss over and think, oh, that wasn't a sundown town, there's an African American population there. But if you dig further into the census data, and it might be that it's all males, all black men living in a town, and there might be a prison in that town, and they're counted as part of the population, but not really part of the community. Loewen has found towns where there was a significant number of single black women living in a town, and figured out that these were domestic servants, domestic workers living in white households. So a town doesn't have to be completely all white to be considered a sundown town. Sometimes we see towns like this where the town may have excluded, violently driven out the entire African American community, but maybe let one or two families stay because they were connected to white families in town, or white families were somehow benefiting from these a few African Americans being in town. And by most definitions, those would still be considered sundown towns because the general majority of African Americans are being told that they are not allowed to be in these towns. So the definition, there's no hard and fast definition, but these are kind of what we see when we talk about sundown towns. I'd like to give a couple of examples here of some of the documentation that historians have found. I should mention James Loewen. He taught at Tougaloo College in Mississippi, and they have his papers. He just passed away this last summer, but they have his papers, and they've continued his project of documenting sundown towns. And again, I'll talk about him in a minute, but much of this information comes from the Tougaloo project that Loewen started. I want to give them credit. So in this slide, you see that there are examples from Indiana and Missouri, right? So the newspaper account there on the left is it's a report from Evansville, Indiana, and it's in 1901. And it's talking about how the towns of southwestern Indiana are trying to drive out their black populations and become sundown towns. And that's the other thing I wanted to mention is that in the research, we find that some towns were sundown towns from the beginning, and oftentimes these were suburbs that grew up in the 20th century, right? And these were suburbs that are designed to be sundown towns. And we see these from the Northeast to Wisconsin to the West Coast. Tarzana, California was a sundown town. So kind of new suburbs. But we also see older towns where there was a black population in the 1800s, and then that population gets driven out. A lot of times by one event, there's a lynching, there's some kind of a precipitating event where the black population gets run out of town, and then African Americans are forbidden to move into those towns in the following decades. And that's what we see happening here in this Indiana example, right? So there was a lynching of African Americans for killing a white barber in a couple of towns. After these lynchings, it spread like a disease in some sense, where all the surrounding towns are trying to drive out the African American population, people that had no connection beyond race with the murder of the barber. So that's kind of one example of what we see happening. The other example I have here is, it's a Western Union telegram, and there was a Black Civilian Conservation Corps project that was scheduled to work in Lawrence County, Missouri. And you can see this Western Union telegram. This is in 1935. They're sending a telegram to the governor saying the citizens of Lawrence County bitterly are opposed to any Negroes coming here. So you have the county, the white citizens of the county telling the governor to keep the Black Civilian Conservation Corps workers from even coming into town. Right. So these are a couple of examples. A couple of more examples come from Arkansas, and Northwest Arkansas in particular, and Northern Arkansas in particular, is a borderland between the North and the South. You know, much like Missouri is a borderland between North and South. And Northwest Arkansas had a series of expulsions of driving the African American community out of the towns, out of this entire region pretty much, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And you can see on the left there's Cotter, Arkansas. This is from 1906, when the entire black community was driven out of Cotter. They're given 24 hours to leave, threatened with violence. And if you think about the level of wealth that was lost, generational wealth, as people lost their houses, people lost their businesses, people were forced to flee with whatever was on the clothes that was on their backs. And then we think about the generational wealth that's built up. It helps connect with kind of income disparities that we see today. And then beside that, you see an advertisement for Mena, Arkansas. This is a 1920s advertisement, and you can see it says the city of the Ozark Mountains, cool summers, mild winters, pure soft water, beautiful scenery, pretty homes, no mosquitoes, no blizzards, no malaria, no drought, no Negroes. And that's how the town was advertising. And we see other ads like this in other towns as well. Right. There was a report, Lowen found a report from a 1980 article where a resident of Mena, Polk County had said that they moved there in the 1980. In the 1980 article, they said they moved there because there were no black people there, except they did not use the term black people. So these are examples of what we see. These are the hints that we see in the research. Sometimes it's one word, sometimes it's just a few words in a city government discussion. Sometimes it's an advertisement or an old newspaper article. Sometimes we see patterns in the census records. But these are the hints that we see about these sundown towns. And much of the credit, as I've mentioned earlier, should go to James Lowen. I have his book here. Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. Lowen was a historian and he was a sociologist, but also became a historian. Most famous for his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. But he was an Illinois native. He's from Decatur. And he never even really thought about sundown towns. And I'll talk in a bit about kind of how this is sometimes just assumed that that's the way things are and people don't question what's underneath. So he wrote this Sundown Towns in 2005, this first book-length study of sundown towns. He used oral history. So he would interview people who lived in the towns and ask them, was there a history of sundown town behavior in the towns? He looked at census data. And in looking at the census data, as I'll mention later, but in looking at the census data, you can see patterns where there's a black population, and then in like 1890 there's a black population, 1900 there's a black population, the 1910 census there's no black population. And so then you start digging in between what happened during that time period. He looked at newspaper archives, town histories, other sources. And his project that started with this book published in 2005, he documented literally thousands of sundown towns across the country. The project that he started that's still ongoing at Tougaloo. Large cities, Appleton, Wisconsin, cities of 40,000 people, and larger, that were sundown towns. Affluent suburbs, Danbury, Connecticut. So affluent suburbs, small rural towns, places in the Northeast and the West Coast. It's a nationwide issue, but particularly in the Midwest. Here's a map that shows kind of the documented sundown towns that Lowen's project has found. And I say Lowen's project because after he passed away, it's still an ongoing thing. And this is also a project that is crowdsourced in some sense. At Tougaloo, they ask people to talk about their experiences of living in these towns or traveling in these towns, and then historians can go back and people can go back and then try to triangulate these experiences with documentation of some sort. So the way that they have the project set up, they have a city that's in gray, a gray circle. People don't know whether it's a sundown town or not. It may be a little bit of information, but maybe not enough yet to know. The town I talked about in Kansas earlier is officially listed as don't know, even though I submitted to them and said, no, I remember this story, but it's a secondhand story from me when I'm a kid in the 70s. So it's not, so it hasn't been documented yet. I'm actually working on that now. But then there are the light colored circles, the light red circles, the pink circles are possible. And this is when there's been a little bit more documentation. Finally, the kind of medium red are probable, more documentation, more oral histories, people confirming what other people have said. And then finally, the brighter red is Shirley, as he calls them. These were Shirley sundown towns. That doesn't mean that they still are sundown towns, but somewhere in the past they were sundown towns. And one of the things that the project also tries to do is to trace and see if these towns were still sundown towns, or if as they say, they've been broken or redeemed, or that they've changed a bit. But you can see the map. You can see how much is in the Midwest, right? And we think about kind of the racial journey of the South, and it's very well known. Right? We know slavery, we know the Civil War, we know Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation. This research, as I mentioned earlier, helps to show kind of institutional racism on a nationwide scale, that it wasn't just a Southern thing. Often these sundown towns were deliberate. Lowens argues that in 1890, only 119 of the nation's thousands of counties did not have any black residents. Right? So thousands of counties in the United States, in 1890, only 119 counties did not have any black residents. Because after the Civil War, you have African Americans who are leaving the South. And even before the Great Migration North, you have African American, that happens in the 20th century, you have African Americans leaving the South. You have before the Civil War, you had African Americans in the West, and you have African Americans in the North. And there were people living in these small towns and in these counties. What Lowen finds is, so only 119 counties did not have any black residents in 1890, but by 1930, 40 years later, 700 counties had no black residents. And that can't just be explained of, well, black people leaving small towns and moving to cities, right? Not when you look at all the other documentation, right? So often we have this kind of idea that communities look the way they do just because that's the way things are, right? For no particular reason. But what I always tell my students is think about where you live and why it looks the way it does. If you live in a suburb where there's a big sign out at the beginning of the neighborhood where it says homes between 180,000 and 250,000, then everybody who lives in that neighborhood is going to be basically from the same socioeconomic status, right? But when we live in these places, we don't really think about that. It just becomes home, and after a few years or a generation or two, we just assume that that's the way things always are. And that's the way things always have been naturally, right? Sundown towns are that way. People can just assume that, a sundown town in rural Illinois, people can just assume, well, no black people live there because no black people ever want to live there. Well, we should ask ourselves, why do we have these assumptions, right? And if we research these places, we might find policies, and we have found policy or cases where these were deliberately exclusionary places. So we know a lot about kind of the South and Southern history as it comes to race. I mean, more work is always still being done, but we know a lot about that. But far less is known of the stories of these sundown towns, especially across the Midwest. This kind of understanding that whiteness is just the default. Whiteness is just kind of neutral, right? Whiteness is just a feature of life. That people oftentimes want to ask, well, why? Why is this town all white? As Clarissa Ryle Hayward, she's a scholar of race, and she's the author of How Americans Make Race. She says, for white people, race is operating but at a level that they don't know how to consciously articulate it to themselves. And oftentimes, as someone who lived in one of these towns, living in this town, it's just an unconscious thing. This is just the way things are. So in sundown towns across the Midwest, and I want to focus on kind of start bringing our focus here into the Midwest, Black Americans were denied housing. They were persecuted, violently driven out, violently evicted in between the 1890s and the 1940s in particular. And it left behind that kind of homogeneity that people then took for granted even to this day, right? So if we look at the next map, I focused it in a little bit. So here is Illinois, and the Midwest obviously too, but here is Illinois. So we begin to see patterns, right? Whenever a town had African-American residents, like in the 1890 census, and then it doesn't have African-American residents in the 1900 census, and then in the next census, there are no African-Americans, then we should ask these questions, why this is so, right? And so there are plenty of places for us to research here in Illinois. And if we take it even further into Madison County, so Lowen in his book, and again, the book came out in 2005, he documented Granite City and East Alton as both places that were surely sundown towns. Further research from his project that continued after his book came out, but that has occurred since, indicates that Glen Carbon was, in his words, also surely a sundown town that has a much larger black population now than it did previously, Glen Carbon. So other towns we see in Madison County are Wood River, we see these Bunker Hill, Staunton. We see these other towns that are also listed, and we see towns that haven't been researched yet as well, right? And I'm hoping that's what people start to do, right? So let's look, for example, at one of the examples that he gives, which is East Alton. In 1930, out of a population of 4,502 people, East Alton had 0 black residents. In 1940, 10 years later, East Alton had 1 black resident out of a town that was now 4,680 people. One thing we do when we look at sundown towns is we also, one of the indicators that a town might be a sundown town is look at the surrounding towns. Look at other towns. If there are no black people in any of the surrounding towns, it may be a sundown county, but it also may be a function of migration patterns, of patterns of movement. But if you have a town where there are black residents in a lot of the surrounding areas, but consistently decade after decade, no or few black residents in that particular town, it's a probably pretty good indication that it's a sundown town. And so if you think about Alton, you think about, you know, St. Louis and Edwardsville and places that have black residents, and then you have East Alton that has no black residents, that's a pretty good indication that it's a sundown town. Well, during World War II, in the defense industry, this became an issue because of the need for defense labor. Olin Industries is in East Alton, right? And it's a company that makes rifle cartridges. It's a company that makes ammunition, still to this day. The president of Olin Industries said they could not hire African Americans because the town wouldn't allow it. So Truman Gibson, who was the aide to the Secretary of War, reported, quote, "East Alton does not allow any Negroes to come into town. They can't ride on the public transportation system. The mayor has said that if they come in, he'll not be responsible for their protection. No Negroes live or work in East Alton." That's from the aide to the Secretary of Defense who was investigating this issue. Malcolm Ross, who was chairman of the government's Fair Employment Practices Board, and not to go off on a tangent, but this is Roosevelt being pressured by A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights activists, early civil rights activists, for desegregation of the factory work in the defense industries. So they create the Fair Employment Practices Board. Malcolm Ross stated that Olin, the company, said, quote, "The company claimed it could not hire blacks because for over 50 years the town had not permitted blacks to live or work there." So the federal government tried to put pressure on East Alton to break this. East Alton wasn't having it. They still refused to allow African Americans to be in East Alton, and it remained a sundown town. 30 years later, there were only 4 black residents in the town of over 7,000 people. Right? East Alton today still has this reputation of being a sundown town. Now again, people from the Madison County Historical Society can research this history. The other example that Lowen gives in his book is Granite City. Now in 1901, there was enough of a black population in Granite City that, as one history of Granite City reports, quote, two schools augment the educational system, one near the levee for blacks and one for whites on the west side of the tracks. So in 1901, they're reporting that there's a black school. Again, that speaks to segregation, which oftentimes people try not to think about as being part of Illinois history. But there was enough of a black population in Granite City to have a school for African Americans. The steel industry boomed, and along with the steel industry booming, Granite City boomed, becoming the largest town in Madison County, the largest city in Madison County. It drew immigrants, as most of the audience knows, it drew immigrants from Bulgaria and Macedonia, elsewhere in Europe, to work in these steel factories. African Americans were excluded from living in Granite City during this time. So while Granite City is booming, these jobs are booming, these European immigrants are becoming Americans and being welcomed into the United States. And as scholars of race talk about, they were becoming white, right? They were becoming white. They had access to these jobs. African Americans could work at some of the steel factories, but could not live in Granite City. Reportedly, African Americans were expelled from Granite City in 1903. So as the population of Granite City boomed, the black population of Granite City declined. So by 1910, there were only 18 black residents out of a town of 9,900 people. By 1970, the town had over 40,000 people, and it only had 6 black residents. Today, there is a growing black population in Granite City. And Lowen, in his book, gives the example. He drives through Granite City and sees black children and white children, and gives the example of maybe this is a sundown town that's changing. slowly changing. But for most of the time that it was Madison County's largest city, it was a sundown town. Now, here at SIUE, we have a project called the Madison County Historical Society, Madison Historical, where it's a digital humanities project where some of our graduate students and some of our historians have done oral histories with residents of Madison County. It's a great project that I'm tangentially connected to. And they interviewed a couple of black residents who grew up in Venice, Illinois. One of the gentlemen was born in 1959 and now lives in Granite City. And in his oral history, he talks about growing up black in Venice and what Granite City meant, like what the view of Granite City was, and the racism he dealt with both in Venice and in Granite City. And I want to just quote him a little bit here. He said, they had the 10-cent store talking about Venice, but then Granite City, which is up the road, now they were a lot more in your face talking about the racism. And would you know, you really come up missing in Granite City. He was taught as a child that if you go to Granite City, you're going to end up like Emmett Till. He said you'd have to be 5 or 7 strong, no less, because you could come up missing. So you knew it was there, but you were taught what to do, where to be, and how to conduct yourself. And so Venice was just basically prejudiced with a little bit of bigotry. Granite City is bigoted and racist. That was his experience. Interestingly enough, he joined the Air Force, lived in Italy, moved all over the world, came back to Venice, and eventually ended up living in Granite City. And he says, I now reside in Granite City. The change that's going on up there, it's getting pretty ugly. And this interview was done in 2016, so this was not that long ago. He said, the property values are dropping. That breeds anger in people because now they're not getting the monies out of your property when you need to reinvest, when you move on. He said, I don't care what color you are. I remember when I first moved to Granite, I was one of the house, my house is, I've got 2 acres of property and it's a 2-story house. Most of the houses are 1-story, so I was black in an all-white area of town, and they didn't make me feel welcome. He said, whenever I was in my yard, once again, they used the old subtle ways. Traffic would go in both directions for as long as I was out in my yard, people staring at me, letting me know they didn't appreciate me being out there. But because of the way that I take care of my property and what I've done to my property, and the people all of a sudden say, quote, we don't mind you being here. And they actually stop and tell me that. When he's out working in his yard, they stop and say, we don't mind you being here. He said, and that's pretty offensive, because what do I care that you agree, that you don't mind me being here, you approve of what I'm doing to my own property, because that's my property. He said, but I was just told that 4 weeks ago. A husband and wife turned around after they drove past, they came up, pulled up on the side while I was edging my yard and told me, you know, we really approve of what you've done in your property. We really think it's pretty, job well done. And I'm like, thank you? Because in my mind, I'm like, lady, what do I care? You know, I'm just trying to be nice. So I'm like, really? You simply could have said my property looks nice. You didn't have to tell me that you approved of my property, is essentially what he's saying. He's talking about these are the attitudes that even though Granite City isn't officially a sundown town anymore, that he is still dealing with in the very recent past. Now, what I'd like to suggest to the people listening is suggestions for further research. I'm actually doing research like this in Kansas right now, in my old hometown and other towns in Kansas, trying to document more sundown towns. We have our students, I have my students working on projects as well, trying to document sundown towns in the Midwest and in Illinois. And so what I'd like to offer to the audience, because there are so many of these towns, it can't just be left up to professional historians to do it. Lowen, the way he set up the project, his project, is it can be kind of crowdsourced in some sense, with people contributing to it. So what I would recommend people doing is go to the Sundown Towns database at Tougaloo College, where these maps came from. When you click on an area, it pulls up that area, it gives you the census data, and it shows kind of what the kind of what the towns were like in terms of African American population in these towns. And you can see whether they've declined or not. They also will have excerpts of oral histories and government documents and things like that that help people find out. So I'd say the first thing is to question assumptions. Don't just assume, oh, this town is all white and it's just always been that way. All right, question assumptions. I've been all over rural Illinois in the last few years. And every town I come into now, I kind of have that question in the back of my mind, when 10 years ago, I maybe wouldn't have. All right. So question assumptions, go to the Sundown Towns database and look up that town and see if there's anything on that town or not. Right? Then you can look at census data, just the overall census data. It's available online from the federal government, or if it's not, it's available through libraries. And look at the census data and see if there was a black population in a town. If the black population stays flat, or if the black population declines, or in a 10-year period is gone, that's a pretty good indication. Because, you know, as towns grow, as cities grow, but the black population becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of that town, that's probably a pretty good indication that people are not feeling welcome for various reasons, right? If the black population just disappeared in like the 1880s or 1890s or 1910, there's a really good indication that there was some kind of precipitating event within that time period. And that's when you then go and look at local histories, you look at local old newspapers to see if they've documented anything. You do oral histories, or you talk to you talk to people. Again, that can be documented with other stuff oftentimes, right? But we really need to do this work to find out what the places we live, what they're really like, what the real history of the places that we live are. Sometimes you may find a town that appears to be a sundown town and it's not, right? There was no precipitating thing, maybe just it's a function of how life worked out. It never had a black population. More likely, you'll probably find that towns that don't appear to be sundown towns were at some point. Also, as I mentioned earlier, look at surrounding towns. And if surrounding towns have a black population, but a certain town doesn't, that's also a pretty good indication that that town might be a sundown town. Now, there were ways that African Americans tried to, and this is where the oral histories really come in, where African Americans tried to navigate this landscape. There are stories of people who were driving from St. Louis to Chicago who would always pack extra fuel in their trunk, because they would not be allowed to stop for gas at certain sundown towns, could be caught certain places. The Green Book, which is available online, was the Black Motorist Travel Guide that would tell African American motorists kind of what towns were safe to stop in and what towns weren't. So there are kind of ways that people were trying to navigate this as well. But this history is out there. We just have to dig it up and find it, and that's what we're trying to do, and that's what I hope everyone else is trying to do as well. So thank you all very much for listening. I appreciate it.